Right, season 1 of Keith Wood's State of the Union is nearly in the books. This is our final episode of the first season, and we started this whole conversation, Keith, talking about the power of the English clubs, the difficulties the RFU had in it, with a little bit of hope perhaps that a global season was at least being talked about in a meaningful way. And I think we're at the end of season 1, and the club versus country issue in England is more pronounced than ever, and I'm not sure we're any closer to a global season.
No, I think we'd qualify as being, it's worse, we're improving at the moment. Yeah, it's a little bit of a mess. I think the vested interest seems to be pushing things too much, to be honest. And I think we're struggling to find any real sense of proper communication on one side, collaboration on another, and compromise, the last one, the 3 C's. And the idea of a compromise is nobody's happy, but at the present moment in time, we've no agreement and nobody's happy.
We're kind of reverse engineering this conversation a little bit, but in the last 24, 48 hours or so, we've seen that there might be the beginning of a breakup of the relationship between South Africa, New Zealand and Australia, which is essentially run Super Rugby in the Southern Hemisphere. That competition kind of seemed like it was in the death throes anyway over the last couple of seasons, as they brought a Japanese team in and they brought a Japanese team out, as they weren't sure how many of the Argentinian teams were going to actually end up being sustainable in that competition. And is travel from Australia to Argentina to play a rugby match actually the right thing for everybody? And it turns out it doesn't look like that's going to be the case. So the South African teams look like they might be now available to play in a different time zone, perhaps a European time zone. What is actually the best outcome from what's going on in the Southern Hemisphere at the moment?
Well, it's funny, when we started this, I don't know how many weeks ago we started, it seems to have been a long time ago, and I've enjoyed an awful lot of it. Andrew Merton spoke about exactly this point on this show, and he was quite interesting, because he was saying, listen, I don't really know an awful lot about the politics or the business side of it, and then he gave his opinion, and his opinion is the one that seems to be closest to what's actually happening. So that what made it very interesting. We didn't give a huge amount of our opinions on it. We were delving for information, trying to, just pull a little bit of information from people that would be in the know. The Super 10s, Super 12s, Super 14s, Super 15s, which it became, was constantly, it's probably the best example of the world of rugby eating itself up. So it needed more. It needed another market, because costs were rising, salaries were rising. It needed another television deal to make certain that growth would go on. It was almost like a Ponzi scheme, where you're waiting for the last people that can survive, and they're going to get burned in part of it. And that huge spread that they had never ever made any sense. And I think it never made sense to anybody that was watching it. And we'll come back to player welfare in a while. And I had a couple of really good, interesting conversations in the last week in terms of that. But the spread of it seems to have gone. And the change from when we had the first conversation, the change has gone that actually people have the sense that they need to be at home, or as close to home as possible. They need to have a very vibrant competition close to home. And then maybe there can be another competition where there's an element of travel in it. And then you've got internationals where there's an element of travel in it. But if you have a competition, your base competition, which we'll say the Super 15 was, and you're traveling all over the globe, that doesn't seem to make any sense at all. So now we've seen in the last 6 weeks, New Zealand having a vibrant competition of a high standard, tinkering with the laws, trying to get the best out of it, nobody leaving their shores, and there's a market. There's a global market for that. And but this idea of going from New Zealand to South Africa, that's just attritional in every way, shape or form, irrespective of climate change, coronavirus, or all the other reasons that you'd say that it seems to be ludicrous. It just seems to be too much. And for me, it's just too much for the players.
I think actually it was Stuart Barnes who talked about the climate change issue, and stuff that we took for granted 20 years ago, 10 years ago, is not going to be stuff that we take for granted into the future. There will come a point where big brands won't want to be involved in a competition that is seen to be flying people for air miles all around the world. And very quickly we're seeing the power of corporations to change things. You look at the NFL and the change of name that's happening with the Washington professional football team, for example. You see how quickly, if there's a will to change things, things can happen that look like they were intractable. So I think that's kind of it's not a major point right now, but it actually probably will become a major point for all of these global competitions. How sustainable are they? How are the teams arriving? What are they doing to offset? And all that kind of stuff. So even if we just park that for a moment, it's really interesting to see what's happening. It's going to be a trans-Tasman competition. This is what the papers have been reporting in the last 48 hours. So essentially, there'll be professional teams in Australia and there'll be professional teams in New Zealand. They'll play each other lots, and then they'll play against each other occasionally. And at the end of that, there'll be a champion. The New Zealanders had this very interesting idea about it would be great at the end of that if we could play somebody else of a similar standard, i.e. a World Club Cup, essentially. So you play against the winners of the Heineken Cup. That sounds great.
Yeah, well, winners are fine. I remember going back. We go to soccer for a moment, and going back to the European Cup and the European Cup Winners' Cup. They were for teams that had won. Now they've become teams who are in the top 4, top 5, because it's more lucrative to do so. But it nearly doubles, that doesn't double, but it heavily increases the amount of games that people have to play. That's probably okay for soccer, for football. Just isn't really okay for rugby. So if you say that we have a World Club competition because you have the winner of New Zealand, the winner of Australia, the winner of South Africa, the winner of whoever else, I think that makes it very difficult. You may have a Southern Hemisphere champion playing a Northern Hemisphere champion. Everybody would want to see it, but you can't build it into this big home and away 3 or 4 different matches that go in on it. I mean, I think if we break everything down for what we've said already, and we say, what has come out of this most? What's come out of it most is that the players have rarely been involved in the discussions, that the season is pretty much 48, 49 weeks long, and that's the ludicrous part of it. And we're probably needing to shed a couple of competitions, a competition or a few layers of competition, so that this makes sense. Because at the present moment in time, there's too many vested interests. And my wish at the start of this was that we might get something like a Lions League up and running. For that to happen, it requires the RFU and the Premier League to say, listen, we're all in this together and we have a coherent body. So if you want, like, the Premiership and the Professional 14 in France, right? They're saying they're not at the table talking about rugby because the Constitution of World Rugby doesn't include them. It includes their unions. That's the nature of it. That's the body that they have to go through. So it's that conversation that the English clubs have to have with the RFU. If that could be solved to say that there was a professional game in England that wasn't one fighting against the other, then you can look after the domestic game separately. Then you can start to fill in some of these holes. But having a competition that goes from 10 matches for internationals, or maybe 12, to 30 or 34 matches, the maths doesn't add up in terms of the players. And that becomes the big issue with this.
Look, I think at the very start, when we were talking about this, I kind of kept asking, how many games should a professional rugby player play? How many games can they play? And in fairness, the answer that kind of fairly consistently comes back is 3 weeks out of 4, or 30-ish games a season. And if you can get an agreement on that, and if the players can agitate for that, then that's a good starting point to work backwards from and say, well, what are the gaps in the calendar when we can actually play? When is there going to be a club game? A window for that. When is there going to be an international game? A window for that. Every 4 years, you've got a World Cup. Every 4 years, you've got a Lions Tour, and they need to fit in this period of time. And away you go. And if if other individual rugby countries want to do some local stuff on top of that, and the players agree to that, and they're getting paid for it, and they're signing waivers that they understand what the damage to their body will be for playing extra games over the course of a season and the shortening of their career that will result from that, then you begin to get a coherent plan where everybody is playing on a level playing field.
Look, I think that is the case. If I was the clubs, I wouldn't agree with what World Rugby were saying in terms of playing October and November, home and away, international, big global season. 8 weeks of internationals, not a chance. You're going to have players will play some, will not play others. That's like a concentrated World Cup, except in a World Cup you're playing against two teams that are not at your level mostly. But in this instance, you're going to be playing against teams that are all at your level. It would be unbelievably difficult. And what happens? You come straight back into the club. You're going to be mush when you come back into the club, you know. So, I mean, some of the thinking behind it has been just, in my view, very flawed. But I think everybody is trying to have and keep their tournament, and let's pile it all in together, and suddenly you're at 48 weeks. Like, it isn't even the 3 weeks out of 4, and that's great, and that is fantastic, but it's also playing over 10 or 11 months. Like, that's just, to try and peak over that period of time is nigh on impossible. And like, I remember I started at the very start of professional rugby. We played a Anglo-Welsh Cup, and I played a couple of those matches. We would play Saturday, Wednesday, Saturday, Wednesday, Saturday. And I remember having a discussion with the coach. Dick Best was the coach, and he thought, look, we have you full time now. You can train for 7 or 8 hours a day, and you can do all this sort of stuff. And he wasn't saying that, but he was trying to just highlight the point. But we played a match, and I played the first 3 matches, so Saturday, Wednesday, Saturday. And he said, well, you were walking around the field on Saturday. I said, well, you asked me to play. And I said, I'll sprint on the first Saturday. I'll jog on the second Saturday, and I'll walk on the Wednesday, and I'll walk on the Saturday, because there's no way around it. I can't do it. You can't recover in time to be able to go and play. And there becomes a law of diminishing returns when we try and play more and more and more. So for me, the solution, and there is a solution, is to start cutting away some of the parts of the competitions. So the Premiership in England was excellent. And then they put in for playoffs and a big grand final at the end. Now, there are 3 big, games that they have, but that's extra games that weren't there before. The Heineken Cup has been tinkered with a fair bit, but I think it needs to be brought up to be a little bit smaller. I have it here sitting behind me.
It's a nice trophy.
It is a very nice trophy. I don't quite know why I have it, but it's here anyway. We'll take it. But
finally got your hands on it.
I was very close to it once, but close is not good enough, really. I'm nearly blushing on the back of that one. But people have to give something, and at the present moment in time, everybody is keeping everything that they have.
Is that
they can't come to a solution.
And is that the issue with the world calendar as it is at the moment? Because again, if we look back over the period of time we've been doing this, there was a couple of weeks there where it looked like we were on the brink of the crisis being used to hurl the whole game forward and come up with a coherent plan for what a year might look like. Is the issue that they want to have 8 weeks of internationals in October, November with the global calendar, and that's not going to work? Is that the main stumbling block at the moment?
I think that was one of the stumbling blocks, but I actually think the issue stems from something far bigger, far more important, is that the powerhouse financially of the game is in Europe. There is an element of big player finance available in Japan, but the powerhouse of the game is up here. And we had this discussion with Philip Brown when he was on, that if New Zealand play in Dublin, they don't get a share of the gate, which is understandable. We have different costs than they have. But that system is a very, very old amateur system. And maybe a tinkering with that could help to make it more advantageous for New Zealand to come up over here. Because when we go down to New Zealand, we may fill the stadium, but the price point is an awful lot lower. So they're not making the same returns from it, and they're the very big brand. So there's something uncomfortable with that. It gets tidied up by the lines every 12 years. But it's one of those instances. It's the American asking the Kerry farmer, how do you get to Killarney? He said, well, I wouldn't start from here, and you have to look at it in this reset. This is where we are. But would you actually build a game around this series of compromises that are already there, financial compromises? And this is a chance, I still think, to maybe break that a little and get moving on again.
Look, we want to keep the Six Nations. It's a great tournament. That doesn't mean it can't be improved. And I'm very interested to see what happens with South Africa. So if we go back to the original question here, you wanted a Lions League. It looks as if the English clubs are not going to go down that direction, that they've decided that their best model is getting rid of relegation and staying as an English league and doing a deal. Now, CVC are involved with them, and they're also involved with the Pro 14, and they're also involved with the Six Nations. So maybe they're the lube that greases the wheels and goes, actually, you know what, by your powers combined, you're much better. It looks like, going to be 4 South African teams who will be playing amongst themselves for a season or two, perhaps. Is it worth the Pro 14 if they're not going to join up with the English saying, OK, 4 good South African teams with your best players, suddenly sharing in a TV deal that is multiplied, obviously, because you actually have your best players playing against our best players? That could be a very compelling league.
It has compelling parts to the league. And that's one of the issues with all of this. There's something compelling about every argument that's been put out, but it's how do they all tie in together? So you suddenly have 4 South African teams playing in the Pro 14. The issues that sit there are going back to travel issues again, and travel issues for every other team that goes down there. The travel cost to South Africa is prohibitive. So the South African teams that have come in haven't been a net gain to any of the teams that have come in. And that's the reason that you're trying to do it, to make money and to have a proper organised competition. And if we're being brutally honest here, none of them are making money. So you're trying not to lose money. So that's the other issue within it. For me, look, it was one of the points Philip Brown brought up, and saying that the Pro 14 was a great competition, and I didn't agree with him, and we were letting him talk because it was great, and he was fantastic, because I think he gave people a huge understanding of some of the pressures that sit within the game. I thought he was incredibly honest, which it's hard to get guys at that level to be so forthcoming. It was brilliant, but I don't think the Pro 14 is a good competition. I think it's fractured. I think it doesn't seem to make a huge amount of sense. I think the Italian teams make it awkward. They haven't offered a huge amount to the tournament. I think the South African teams that have been in have offered very little to it. I understand the rationale under which to do it, but it's going to extra markets to make it bigger again and again. That's the issue.
Yeah. And that obviously hasn't worked very well in Super Rugby. Let me put this forward as a potential model for the Pro 14. You get rid of the 2 crappy South African teams, and you get the 4 good ones in, right? And actually, what you then do is you make the conferences be more interesting and more local. So there's a home and away for Leinster, Munster guaranteed. There's home and away for the best South African teams against each other, and so there's loads of local games. And then there's a 5-week period in the middle of the season where you all play your international stuff, and then the final 3 or 4 weeks to decide placings and who gets through to the playoffs is local again, and only the winners qualify for a tournament where you've got the winners of the Pro 14, the winners of the English Championship, the winners of the Trans-Tasman, and they play in Doha or wherever is safe and wants to pay you money to come. And there's a 4-team tournament, semi-finals and final, and that's your world champion. And this is all done over a condensed period of time, as opposed to on, off. And actually, there's not going to be relegation. So fair enough, everybody understands that in any of these leagues, more than likely, perhaps with the exception of the French. But there's a reason for those games to matter in the Pro 14, because you actually win loads of prize money for winning the World Club Championship. Is that enough of a pyramid building up towards something?
I do. I think there's great merit in something like that, and something that's tidied like that. Where does that then fit with the European Cup?
Maybe the European Cup ends up not existing in this. I don't know.
Well, I think the European Cup can exist as being part of something that is a World Cup. But if you're to do it, you have to try and take something else out. So for me, we still go back to travel, and I know that, you know, in any graph, there's peaks and troughs, and we're at the trough now at the moment in terms of spectators, in terms of finances being taken away from sport and from every other business. And that makes it very, very difficult. And we don't want to take this as being the norm. The norm is somewhere halfway up. But I do think that the idea of excess travel will have a part to play. And I think it becomes more, I don't want to keep banging the drum, but it becomes more reasonable to think of CVC being in charge of a couple of different tournaments, one of them which becomes a Lions League because of the variety of different things that happen. And if they then get involved in the Lions, well, they're one of the biggest. They are already one of the biggest players in World Rugby. I mean, they are the biggest independent player in World Rugby. So, look, but something has to give within that, and also having, I think, the strength of, let's take a team like Leicester playing in the Premiership, long history, doing very well, playing in the third week of August, and still playing in May. That may just be far too long of a season for them to have. And so they're bearing the brunt of holding players for that period of time. Ultimately, I think the finances for the players are going to change. And if none of the teams are making money and they're all suffering heavily, irrespective of CVC money, that's money that's coming in on the expectation of a lot of money being made in the future, right? So all those things have to be paid for in time. Are you going to end up with salaries that are gone back to appearance fees and win bonuses, and you'll have a good solid salary, but it may not be to the level that it is at the present moment in time? And if that happens, well, you're okay to have a player for a period of time, and then you know that he's going to be gone for 3 or 4 months, and you're not having to pay him for that 3 or 4 months. I mean, you have to look at it in that fashion, because at the moment, people are trying to say who owns the players and who has the primacy of the contract. That is a big issue.
And that, again, brings us right back to the very start, where it's the English clubs and the French clubs who are, despite the fact they're not at the table and having conversations, are ultimately two very important power blocks here whose self-interest is essentially stopping everything else from happening. And if you put yourself in their shoes, you can understand why they're paying the vast majority of the wages. The vast majority of the money that is earned by those players in England and in France is paid by those clubs, has been taken from the pocket of some wealthy individuals for whatever reason they're doing it, and not in a way that's profitable in most instances. And I can see why they would look at the RFU and go, well, you guys don't have your own house in order, so I'm actually not going to cooperate with you because I don't really see you having my interest at heart. And sport is a business, and these people are in that for, again, sometimes it's vanity, sometimes they think they're about to make money. No one's actually managed to do that just yet, really, on any sustained basis in club rugby. So that's that power blockage, and I don't see any way around or any signs of that being fixed anytime soon.
Well, I don't know particularly whether they've tried. So if you were to say that the professional game is something separate, that could be a new entity from the RFU and the Premiership. That could be a new entity that runs that side of it. They look at the breakup of money within the professional game and they figure out a plan that makes that work, knowing that they have to look after the community or domestic game, that has to get a huge amount of funding. I think they put 37.5 million into that last year in England. So knowing that has to be the case, that is the opportunity to break something there. Otherwise, it feels like there's just too many egos fighting their own corner, and they believe in compromise until they have to compromise themselves. and they don't believe in that. And that's where it sits a little bit uncomfortably. So you see some of the clubs going for big cuts because they need to go for big cuts. But you see the RFU going for big cuts. But you've two groups paying the same players. Now, not all the same players, but paying the same players at different times. They need to tidy these things up to be, I would say, proper contracts, as opposed to contracts that were built on the back of old agreements that have stemmed from the amateur days. And like, they've changed year after 5 years, after 10 years, 15 years. Of course they change, but they're always built on an old amateur ideal. And that needs to be solved at some stage. Actually, that is a more important issue to fight the corner with. So if there are riches to be made, wouldn't you rather that all component parts made the riches?
So in that model, the professional game in England would essentially take over the contracting of the players and would license them to, at one part of the season, to a club, and would license them at one part of the season to the international team. And the money that would derive from TV rights would then be distributed by that body to the clubs to pay that amount of salary and to the country to pay that amount of salary, and then with your 37 million growing to fund the grassroots.
Absolutely. And that seems to make sense. Now, we have a version of that in Ireland, though it's entirely run by the IRFU. And the provinces within it are effectively partners with, even though they're part of, but they're also like partners of the IRFU in all these sort of things. And we're not to say that that is perfect. It isn't perfect. But I think it's about 80% of the way there. You know, it's actually in a very good position.
There's just one point on this that I wanted to bring up that we didn't really get into over the course of this season, but that we can come back to, because the provinces will be back in action by the time season 2 comes back, and it'll be a good opportunity for us to delve into each of the 4 provinces and see how they do their business. We always hear this: the international game is the be-all and end-all in Ireland. It generates all of the revenue, 80% of the revenue for the entire game, which funds everything. It funds the development officers, it funds the coaches, and it funds all our facilities, and it pays down the debt of everything. And it's not the provinces who make that money. I'm always like, well, just hang on a second here now, because it is actually the provinces who create the players. Like, all of those players come through the provinces. They're the ones who are putting those players out, giving them game time, coaching them on a day-to-day basis, and turning them from elite school children into world-class players. And in any business, I would own that player, as opposed to, so you centrally contract him, you swoop in, take my asset off me, and then tell me that I'm not actually making any money for you when actually you're using my resources to create all the funding. And if I was Munster or Leinster in particular, I'd be like, hang on a second here. Just when you keep telling everybody that you're the be-all and end-all with the international team, they're my players. We made them.
Yeah. There's a little bit of smoke and mirrors with all of that, because the IRFU ultimately pay for those players, and they pay for all those programs that happen. That's money that goes to Munster from the IRFU to be able to do it. Albeit, Munster, if they were their own entity, would be able to negotiate their own rights, which they do commercially, but would be able to do it in terms of TV rights or in terms of everything else. So all that money goes into the IRFU. So, as I said, it's 80% right. It's not 100% right. And sometimes there's a bit of a poor mouth that's being played from one side to the other to try and figure out which way is it going.
Well, that's it, really. And I suppose I'm just saying that from the provincial point of view, where we get told that they're not these brilliant businesses, that they're running at a loss. I'm like, well, actually, you should pay them for the value that you get from their players. You should be kicking down to them a percentage of your income, and you choose not to. It's like it just doesn't make sense to say this is a separate thing that's a drain on our resources, because it isn't.
No, it's not. It's nothing is separate within it. And in terms of, I think if you were to look at any business, and you had four departments or 5 departments, as Ireland have, maybe 6, 7 if you include the women's game and the sevens program, and you include the domestic. So let's say there's 8 departments in the IRFU, and the IRFU makes a profit at the end because of all those different parts. Some of those are loss leaders that are losing money. Some of them you'd like to tidy up and have a little bit more lean so that it isn't losing money. But ultimately, the parent company is making money. And so I would say in that figure, you're dead right. Munster might lose a bit of money and they say, God, that's not a really well-run business. I believe all the provinces could be run at a better level. And I think they're all putting huge strides in. And actually, in this period of time, there's a colossal amount of work happening behind the scenes. We don't hear about it because there's no sport going on, but there's a huge amount going on behind the scenes. But I think they're all pretty successful, actually. You know, they're not being picked up by, there isn't somebody sitting picking up the tab, and people would say the IRFU are, but Munster is the IRFU, Leinster is the IRFU, the IRFU are both of those as well.
Yeah,
it's a very complicated, but as I said, I think it's 80% right. I just wish the perception was a little bit better, you know, and but these are strong teams by comparison to England. These are incredibly strong.
And sustainable is the other thing. They are absolutely sustainable. At the level of investment that's required to get them to the point they're at, they're super sustainable. The reason I'm talking about this a little bit is because there were certainly strong rumours coming from Australia that perhaps Australia was going to go down a model where they would not have any domestic professional teams, that they would allow all their players to go overseas like their Australian soccer team essentially, and they'd have a league at a certain level but not a great level, and that their best players would play in Europe or perhaps in New Zealand, and ultimately because the clubs there were costing too much to run because all the money gets made by the senior international team. But you're like, that's not really fully realising that you need to invest the money in these players so that they can then reach a standard and continue to grow, and your coaching tree grows and your philosophy grows from these clubs into the senior international side. So that whole kind of, the international game finances everything else. Everything else allows the international teams to exist. This is a very delicate ecosystem.
It is. It's a symbiotic relationship, and it's one that needs to be considered in that fashion. So are we going to go down the line of, and bearing in mind rugby is very much a community-oriented sport, right? So are we going to go down the line where you have individual owners that pull all the strings? Or can you get a hybrid model where there are riches within the game and they can be shared between the individual owners and the unions, right? So for me, that's the best bet, because if you look at the Australian model, they have 4 or 5 teams. They have to actively go out and raise as much money as they can, but you can maneuver it if you own the players as one entity. Then at least you have a chance.
Yeah.
But at the moment, look, and I would do the exact same. Your players are playing one off against the other to try and get a better value and to push up the value. But I do know that within France at the present moment in time, they are working incredibly hard to not have as many foreign players coming in. So if that continues to work and you end up with an incredibly strong French league, 2 French leagues, and a strong French international team, and to be honest, I think France are exactly their own special circumstances. I think the English are not. I think there was a mistake made by the RFU in 1995, and they've been suffering for it ever since. But I think you could end up with a compromised body there where you could share the riches, but you can't let 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 individuals who have a lot of money just drive the future of the game. For me, that would worry me.
And look, I would be very worried about that too. And I think that actually English exceptionalism in all walks of life has led us to a position we're in at the moment. We see how they've handled COVID. We see how they've handled Brexit. You can see how easy it is for 10 or 12 sports owners to decide, well, we know better than everybody else. Like, very easy for those people to bind together and just decide that they're going to be intractable. And that's why you raise a very interesting point there about the future of the game and what the model is going to be. Because if you look at what's happened to the Premier League, for example, countries are buying teams and it is completely skewing any sense of competition. And we've seen, since the Abramovich money came in and the inflation started, that league has become very imbalanced. There are 3 or 4 teams every season who believe that they have a chance of success, and everybody else is just making money from being fodder for them as games go. And the value of those clubs as social institutions is being eroded in many places because they are actually just corporate machines to sports wash nation states. Like, that's the danger if you don't get a handle of what you want your sport to be. And rugby has an opportunity, because the unions are so strong in various places, to have a league and a system of play that doesn't go the same way as the Premier League. So it's actually a big moment for the future of the sport right now.
I think it's a big moment. I look at I look back at the break from rugby union to rugby league over 100 years ago as a schism in the sport, and I keep wondering whether there's time for that to happen again. And I think that would make it very hard. Do the English Premiership go out on their own? Do the RFU decide, actually, we're not going to do this? We have got this wrong over a period of time. We're going to accept the fact we could have 4 or 5, 6 or fallow years, and let's bring up an 8-team league and set it up in England and see where we go with that. Would some of the existing clubs already go in? Because some of them are losing money. They might come in. And you might be left with 3 or 4 clubs entirely on the outside. Now, there are so many ramifications for something like that to happen. It would be incredibly difficult for that to happen. But England could then get on top of what that is. And you could end up with a separate rugby union type organisation. And people may drift from one to the other. But actually, if all the funding is being driven heavily by the unions, that's probably where the money would lie. I think you'd have a couple of really bad years, but whether that's something that would be possible to happen. And I always felt there was 2 or 3 occasions where that could have happened in the 90s and didn't happen. But by whatever dint of leadership or visionary tactics that were needed, you'd like something to be... Because if England got sorted out, I think most things get sorted very, very quickly. You could try and change the French, but I don't see that happening.
No.
So that's where it would be. And look, I played over in Harlequins. I loved the place. I thought it was fantastic. I loved the league. I was on record in '98 saying, look, under no circumstances should we have relegation. I don't believe, as I used to chat to our owners in Quins, and I was captain of the club, and I used to have lots of conversations with them on it. That's 23 years ago now. And for people to have a 1 in 12 chance of going out of business, that's basically what it was. And people say, well, that's sport. No, it's not, actually, and I would follow the American model with proper franchises that are all vested, and you have an opportunity. The difference we talk in American football or baseball or even basketball is, yes, basketball you can play as a team in the Olympics, but that's something very separate. Our game has been based around community and internationals. That's pretty much the way it's been. The internationals is the pinnacle of the game. In nearly any other sport, pretty much the club game is the pinnacle. And I think a lot of people would like that to be the case, but I don't know that that's sustainable.
How hopeful are you, as we wrap up this final episode of season 1, how hopeful are you that we're trending in the right direction, that the right conversations are happening amongst the right people, that there are good ideas out there that people are kind of sharing and having a conversation about and saying we could get behind that, or that's not right, maybe we could tweak it?
I don't know that we're in the right place at the moment in time. I thought we were, same as yourself, I thought we were a couple of months ago. I think we may be again in a few more months because... look, coronavirus, and we've been very careful not to talk about it too much. We were trying to talk about it beforehand, but that's had a huge impact on it. And yes, there is money from CVC coming in. That money could have been phenomenal to pre-COVID. Could have been phenomenal. You could push the game to wherever you wanted. Now it fills a hole, and maybe doesn't fill it fully. So I think that means some teams survive, but I think we could have a few teams fall by the wayside. I think, and there are big club teams in Europe. I think that could happen. I think it needs to be rationalised a little bit, and I don't think people are thinking along those lines. I still think there's big drives for power within rugby at the moment, between the clubs and between certain unions. And I don't know that I can see that happening yet. I mean, I do see changes that could happen. My own personal opinion, again, is, and this flies against Six Nations, and what they would say is that Italy haven't performed in the 20 years that they've been there. And I think if you're looking for a very potent competition, I could see South Africa going in there. I know I've had a discussion with Stuart Barnes about it. He hates that idea with a passion. And yet I do think that that's something that would make it stronger. And there have been changes in the Six Nations. Obviously, it was 5 nations, and it was 4 nations at one stage. And France came in the 20s or whatever it was. There has been change, but there's never been somebody that's been taken out. So that would be a huge change. But yeah, I'm uncertain. The reason I'm uncertain was, if I go back to the competition for chairman of World Rugby, Bill Beaumont and Gus Pichot were, they had very similar views, which was making the game bigger. And look, again, I go on my own view. I think the game needs to be smaller, not bigger. And expanding seems to be putting us under increased pressure.
When you say smaller, we should just tease that out a little bit before we do finish up, because what do you actually mean? You don't mean fewer... What do you mean? That's a better question. What do you mean?
Yeah, so my idea, like everybody says, we need to drive the game to the 4 corners of the world, and it's brilliant. We've got another union and another unions after joining. Isn't that fantastic? Rugby is a very complicated sport. It is not football. It is not as easily translatable across the line, not just because of the difficulty for players, but the difficulty in putting structures in place for health and safety, the difficulties in having refereeing at the high enough standard to protect the players as well. And in this drive to be something, for me, I think when the game changed from IRB to World Rugby, for me that was a line in the sand that the game wanted to be something that it wasn't. Like, rugby is still, I would consider it a niche sport. It's a very big sport in some countries. You're always going to have powerhouses to try and get other teams to come in to be a powerhouse. And people will talk about Japan and how they became players in the last World Cup. It was their World Cup. They were together for 10 months to perform in that World Cup with very little distraction away from it. There was a huge amount of investment went in to make that happen. That's unlikely to happen in a lot of other countries. It really is. There is a big commercial corporate arm to rugby in Japan. And so I think we're probably left with the 14, 15, 16 teams and out to 24 teams that can compete. We need a couple of different levels where teams can move up and have an opportunity to progress and get better. But I think trying to include everybody puts us into a very awkward position. So if I look at American football, I'll go back to American football again, which isn't countries, but they said there's X number of franchises that we can have and we can make sustainable. Let's get the best out of this. And it is this most potent, if you like it, American football. It's enthralling. It's got a 16-week regular season. It's got another 4, 5, 6 matches. That's it, tops. I'm not saying that it needs to be bigger than that, but they've defined the parameters of what the game is. I don't think we've ever really done that in rugby.
I think you're exactly right. I don't think it actually needs to be that much bigger than that. I mean, you could have 2 international windows, and the rest of the year is club, and everybody gathers round for the international windows, and that all the club seasons end on the same day, and we crown champions, and maybe they all play the following week. Like, there's definitely a template there if everybody is willing to kind of step back a little bit and step sideways and make those compromises. But
sure, I have to tell you, I've written out 10 seasons since lockdown. I'm approaching a high level of insanity in relation to it, because and the only time you start making it work is actually if one entity owns the players. Because if 2 own the players, it just doesn't work. You know, so every time a player is taken away from them, they feel it's a draw on their reserves and their resources, as opposed to them making something on the back of it. Even if they get paid for it, it doesn't matter. it just feels as if there's always a reluctance on different sides. And look, I can understand at some stage there been a decent legal challenge over primacy. So within the laws of rugby, the international teams have primacy over their players. It's an interesting thing to say, I own you, you know, and it's a club says, well, actually, I pay him. He's my employee. He's only a representative to play for your country. There could be a case sitting in there. So look, I've gone through a whole variety of everything and trying to compromise for every team. And I'm on the commercial board of Munster, so I want Munster to do very well. But I think the Irish system is, as I've said, very, very close to being right. You know, it's not right, but very close to it. The New Zealand system is very close to it, but it doesn't have, and it isn't on the corner of Europe where there is financial might. So they struggle for different things. But it's messy trying to fit them all in. But if you go into blocks and run from start to finish and run another competition at the end and run some internationals in 2 windows, I think you could do it. But we want it in 3 windows, and we want cup competitions that all come to a crescendo at the same time of the year, and we'll delay those for you to go on a trip for Ireland the day after or whatever. And so it isn't right, but it's like, I would say it's broken, but I would say it could be fixed, but it requires people to, for me, it's power and control. And there's no way you get rid of that from people's hearts or minds.
No, it's been a brilliant and really engaging season 1. I hope you've had the same level of feedback, Keith, that we have, where people have been really engaged with it and very interested in the various conversations and guests we've had. So I'm looking forward to our little bit of off-season and the return of season 2. Absolutely, I've loved it, and people have been interested, and to make our game, to give them all the information that's out there, because people watch it on a Saturday or a Friday and say, wow, that's fantastic, but they don't really know the ins and outs that go behind it and how the arms of some of the clubs and provinces are tied at different times. So we need to delve into that a little bit more, and we need to have a very good look at the lines, and I think that's going to be part of season 2 as well. Looking forward to it. Great stuff, Keith. Thanks a million. Brilliant. Thanks, Ger.
OTB's State of the Union with Keith Wood. The OTB Sports app. Listen to OTB Sports Radio 24/7.